Have you ever been told to stay silent? Not because you were wrong, but because someone decided your voice wasn't worth hearing? It's like standing in a room blazing with light, yet every gaze slides right through you, as if you were just an extra chair at a banquet of power. They cut you off. They smile politely. But inside that smile, you can hear the click of opportunity's lock slamming shut. Ava Kingsley had lived that moment in full, and she knew the worst part wasn't being ignored. It was being treated as if you didn't exist, right in front of everyone. But Ava didn't just dream of being heard. She dreamed of the day her voice would become something they couldn't ignore. A day when everyone in that room of power would fall silent, just to hear her. Then one fateful morning, that moment arrived, but not in any way she or anyone else could have predicted. What began as an interruption meant to close a door ended up opening a direct path into the very heart of the power game. A single "don't speak" that was meant to tie Ava's hands instead became the key that would strip every person in that room bare. If you believe that silence isn't always surrender, stay with me. This story will make you look at yourself and at the times you've swallowed your chance to answer back. Before we begin, hit that like button, share this story so more people can hear it, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Because every day there's another journey that will leave you both furious and deeply satisfied. And so, on that morning, inside the 60th floor boardroom of a gleaming glass tower, Ava Kingsley set a folder down on the table, ready to present a plan that could save the entire company. But after just her first 3 words, a hand went up and a sentence was spoken that would change everything. The 60th floor of the glass tower rose into the gray sky like a cold, unyielding crown. The dark wooden door swung open to reveal a room so vast that footsteps echoed like in an empty theater. White light poured from the ceiling, glinting off the polished surface of the long wooden table, casting a cool reflection onto glasses of pristine water. 2 rows of black leather chairs stood in perfect alignment, the smell of new leather mingling with polished wood, like silent sentinels guarding the space. The air had weight here, thick and heavy, as if every breath had to be earned. The men in dark suits sat like monuments to power, their ties knotted tight as though swearing allegiance to a fixed order. Watches gleamed under the lights, every nod or raised brow carefully measured. At the head of the table, a chair larger and higher than the rest, more throne than seat, waited for its owner. Gregory Hines, the kind of man whose mere entrance could drop side conversations into silence. Amid all this calculated uniformity, Ava Kingsley stood out in a way no one could ignore. Her fitted sapphire dress without a single crease cut through the sea of black. Soft curls framed her shoulders, and her deep, bright eyes carried the calm of someone who already knew how the story would end. But it wasn't just her skin tone that marked her as different. It was what she carried, a thick folder and an unnervingly steady composure. As she took her seat, Ava could feel certain eyes on her, not curious but appraising, as if calculating why she was even here. She'd been in enough rooms to know she didn't need nameplates to figure out who would oppose her, who would pretend to be neutral, and who would simply wait to see which way the wind blew. This was not a room that welcomed outsiders, especially voices that didn't belong to the majority. A thought narrated itself in her mind, and in this story. There are rooms that don't need signs for you to know you don't belong. Not because of how they look at you, but because of how the chairs are arranged, and how their silence takes the shape of exclusion. But today, Ava wasn't here to ask for permission to speak. She was here to leave a mark they couldn't erase. The room might be cold, the leather chairs colder, but she knew that when a storm rises, it's the walls that shake first. The thing is, they think they've locked the door. They don't know Ava has the key. She placed the folder on the table, flipping the first page like a conductor about to cue an opening note. Her voice was low but steady, every word carrying to the far end of the room. This project, she began, if implemented correctly, won't just keep the company above water during this crisis. It will also... A chair scraped softly at the head of the table. Gregory Hines leaned back, fingers laced, his gaze sweeping over her as though inspecting a smudge on polished wood. Before Ava could finish her sentence, his voice cut in. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rushed, but it had a tone sharp enough to slice the air. Only those who understand high-level strategy are permitted to speak. The words fell onto the table like a cold coin, shattering the flow she'd just built. No one gasped, but the air dipped in temperature as though the room itself had exhaled. Ava remained standing, hands on the table, but she could feel the eyes sweeping over her. Not with empathy or curiosity, but with a quiet satisfaction. A faint chuckle came from the far corner, followed by a few more, thin, sharp sounds. A younger executive in a subtle pinstripe suit leaned toward his neighbor, whispering just loud enough for Ava to hear, probably just trying to keep the room free of off-key voices. No one needed to explain the meaning. Ava didn't look his way, but her eyes darkened, deep as a lake about to ripple under a sudden wind. She inhaled slowly, then sat, closing the folder as though the presentation had never been on the agenda. Gregory went on, seamlessly resuming his monologue. He spoke of market share, growth metrics, and critical priorities, all underscored by the deliberate absence of eye contact with Ava. The room fell back into its familiar rhythm, except for one fact. Ava was still there, and she was hearing every word. Leaning back slightly, she rested her hand on the table, tapping her index finger in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each tap was like the ticking of a clock counting down. No one noticed that she had already started a different kind of meeting, one where people lose without even knowing they're playing. Beyond the glass wall, the city pulsed on, traffic moving in steady streams. Inside, the sealed air of the boardroom held its breath for a storm it didn't know was coming. Ava understood. Sometimes the sharpest response is no response at all, at least not yet. They thought they'd silenced her, but people who close doors often forget. Echoes carry farther when no one else is speaking. She sat as though the interruption had been nothing more than a passing draft. But beneath the calm, her muscles were drawn taut, like strings wound to their limit. Her eyes never left the table, not to watch the speaker, but to memorize the room's layout, the distance between seats, and who was leaning toward whom to whisper. Her right hand turned the watch on her left wrist. A tiny, almost imperceptible beep sounded inside the device, signaling that something had begun. The screen stayed black, but the watch had become a second set of ears, quietly absorbing every word tossed into the air. No one noticed. They kept talking, trading figures, smirking now and then at a new statistic. Gregory, still at the head, was sketching on the whiteboard, his voice droning like a lecturer with a script no one dared interrupt. Ava tilted her head, twirling the fountain pen in front of her as if following along. But in her mind, each statement was being filed neatly into a single drawer. Weaknesses. Outside, gray clouds began to thin the daylight, casting the room in a duller tone. Ava found it fitting. This was the light of backroom deals, and she was sitting in their epicenter. She didn't need to interrupt. The only job now was to let them reveal themselves. The wise know when to be silent, and when to turn silence into a weapon. Ava had learned that lesson early, not in boardrooms, but in cramped kitchens where adults spoke of how to survive when you weren't invited to the main table. There, silence wasn't weakness. It was time to watch. To learn who held the knife and who only pretended to cut the cake. Gregory kept sketching his vision of the company's bright future. Nods here, murmurs there. Ava bent over her notebook and wrote a single line. Empty promises echo loudest in closed rooms. No one realized they were leaving fingerprints all over the conversation. No one noticed Ava's eyes no longer on the board, but looking straight through the room, as if she had already seen how it would end. They thought she was out of the game, but the real game hadn't even started. The boardroom hummed with a familiar sound. Deep, deliberate voices, weighted with authority, each one speaking as though the only audience worth impressing was themselves. One by one, the executives presented the achievements of the last quarter. Their words were smooth, polished, each sentence flowing with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it in front of a mirror a dozen times. Ava sat still, her eyes sweeping across each face, her ears recording every number. It all sounded like a meticulously arranged symphony, until you noticed the notes were being played on an instrument hopelessly out of tune. Revenue up. Market share expanded. Risks completely under control. The words rang bold and triumphant, but Ava knew exactly where the truth was buried. She thought of a saying she'd once heard, "Fresh paint on a wall often hides the damp rot underneath." In this room, every word they spoke was a coat of that paint. Shiny, convincing, but unable to mask the stench of what lay beneath. Gregory nodded approvingly at each report, his face glowing with pride as though he'd just heard the opening anthem to a new golden era. One director stood and drew a growth chart on the whiteboard. The sweeping blue curve soared toward the sky, and a few people murmured softly like they were witnessing a miracle. Ava looked closer and saw the vertical scale had been adjusted to make the curve appear twice as steep. She didn't write it down. She didn't need to. Another spoke of strategic investments that, in reality, were risky gambles, each one capable of pulling the entire company under if it failed. His voice was steady, confident, as if he were announcing a groundbreaking discovery. Ava slowly twirled her pen, each rotation a way to keep from asking the question they were all desperate to avoid. The polite chuckles, the synchronized nods, the perfunctory compliments, all blended into a chorus of self-satisfaction. But to Ava it sounded like an echo in an empty cave, loud, repetitive, and hollow. She didn't need to say a word. All she had to do was listen, because if you let people talk long enough, they'll tell you everything. And when they believe the room is full of allies, they'll never notice the one person who isn't nodding along. They were adding another coat of paint. Ava was waiting for the moment to scrape it away. Sitting in that cold leather chair, her mind drifted from the room. The numbers and buzzwords washed over her, carrying memories of other meetings. Times she'd been cut off mid-sentence or worse, ignored entirely, as though her words were nothing more than background noise. She remembered one morning, years ago, in another high-rise conference room. She'd offered a solution, only for the facilitator to look past her and ask the opinion of the man seated beside her. The proposal, her proposal, was repeated word for word and greeted as a stroke of genius, because it no longer had her name attached. That was when Ava learned, in rooms of power, not all voices carry the same weight. Back in the present, Gregory was in full stride, laying out his long-term vision. His expression carried the confidence of a man who believed himself the center of this universe. Ava listened as though she were watching an endless play, one where the lead character never realized the audience had already grown restless. Her gaze drifted to the window. Beyond the glass, the city stretched out in every direction, streets weaving like veins in constant motion. Traffic surged, lights flashed, towers rose against a gray sky. Life outside was moving, changing, competing by the second. Inside, a handful of people locked themselves in the illusion that they were controlling the current. The contrast was stark. Outside, motion and evolution. Inside, a self-contained bubble of certainty. And Ava knew nothing was more dangerous than a group convinced it couldn't be wrong. She looked back at them, the confident faces, the nods in a perfect rhythm, the reflexive excellence tossed into the air. It reminded her of grand ships sinking while passengers still raised their glasses, believing the music would play forever. She had no intention of cutting in. Patience, she'd learned, was the sharpest blade. Left unchecked, they would keep exposing their own cracks, and when the time came, their own words would be the evidence against them. Ava inhaled slowly, her eyes on Gregory as if measuring the distance to the first fracture in the wall he'd built. Outside, the city kept moving, and so did she, without ever needing to make noise. They were performing for each other. She was rewriting the script. The meeting ended with chairs sliding back, pens tapping the table, and brisk handshakes. Papers were gathered quickly, as if a major battle had just been won. Gregory rose first, tucking his pen and notebook away, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd just closed a historic deal. Ava didn't rush. She stacked her folder with deliberate slowness, giving everyone time to notice she was still there, untouched, unmoved. As footsteps shuffled toward the door, she lifted her head, offering a faint smile, and spoke just loud enough to reach every corner. "Thank you, Ed, for speaking on my behalf." Her tone was even, almost gentle, but in the stillness, the words dropped like a small stone into a still pond. The ripples were subtle, but anyone sensitive enough would feel them. It wasn't just gratitude. A few people froze, their eyes blinking fast as though they'd sensed something unsettling in her calm. An older director glanced at Gregory, waiting for a reaction. But Gregory, seasoned in the art of believing himself untouchable, simply straightened his tie and walked past her, as if the remark were nothing more than a stray draft of air. Ava kept smiling, but inside she knew she'd just set the first stone in the water. Not to make a splash, but to see where the current would carry it. Words that seem harmless often linger the longest, not because they're loud, but because no one knows quite how to answer them. When the door closed behind the last of them, the room was empty. Light from the window stretched across the long table in a narrow strip, like a road leading somewhere unknown. Ava rose, tucking her watch beneath her sleeve, and stepped out, leaving the dark wooden walls to hold the faint echo of what she'd just said. They thought they'd silenced her, but in silence, sometimes a single sentence can outlast any speech. Ava had planted the seed. Now it was only a matter of seeing who noticed it sprout first. Ava's office sat tucked away in a quiet corner of the top floor, far from the chatter and laughter of the open workspace. Sunlight spilled through the window, casting a pale gold rectangle across the dark wood of her desk. She sat straight-backed, hands resting lightly on her laptop keyboard, like a pianist about to play a piece she'd rehearsed for years. On the screen, an email window stood open, empty except for the recipients field, already filled. The full list of shareholders, the audit committee, and a few addresses Gregory would never imagine she had. Beside the laptop, her smartwatch lay still, but the data inside it had already been downloaded, ready to become evidence. Ava dragged an audio file into the email. It contained every word, every inflated number, every hollow compliment that had echoed in the boardroom that morning. Next came the real figures, pulled from a system only a handful of people knew how to access, Ava being one of them. She paused, staring at the blinking cursor in the subject line. No long explanations, just a single sentence. The truth needs no defense. She read it again, imagining how it would sound in the ears of the people about to receive it. It carried no emotion, but it had the weight of a stone dropped into the bottom of a well. At the end, she typed, "Don't look for the sender. Look for your own answers." No name, no identifying marks, but Ava knew a few would suspect. By the time they were certain, it would be too late to stop the damage. Her finger touched send. A light tap, noiseless, but in that moment, the invisible wire between her and Gregory trembled for the first time. Outside, the city moved on, unchanged. Somewhere, though, inboxes would soon light up, and those who opened them would hear a different kind of sound. The sound of a mirror reflecting the truth they'd tried to avoid. Ava closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window. The city kept its own rhythm. Taxis pulling to the curb, pedestrians hurrying past, the faint blare of a horn from far below. No one out there knew that in a small office high above, a counterattack had just been launched. They had silenced her. Now that silence was speaking for her. The email made no noise leaving Ava's outbox, but minutes later it began creating noise elsewhere. In one office, a notification pinged. In another, a shareholder clicked the audio file and heard their own laughter in the boardroom. Layered between Gregory's confident voice reciting numbers everyone knew were fiction. Phones began to ring. First one, then two, then a row of them down a corridor. Voices on the other end were tense, stripped of their usual politeness. The questions came in a loop. Who sent this? And where did these figures come from? In a small legal conference room, a group huddled over a screen, replaying the recording, pausing at sensitive points. One person exhaled sharply and tossed a pen onto the table, as if already knowing this could never be buried with a press release. The hallways grew restless. Hurried footsteps, sharp clicks of heels, urgent whispers in corners. Young employees exchanged glances as they noticed the sudden pallor on faces of authority. A junior assistant was pulled into an office and emerged moments later, clutching a file like it was the building's last secret. Internal messages pinged across executives' phones. Several stepped away from desks, leaning against glass walls to make hushed calls, their irritation leaking into every word. Gregory's name was in nearly every conversation, accompanied by words like dangerous and uncontained. On the top floor, outside the boardroom, doors slammed shut, chairs scraped across the floor. An emergency meeting was called before the afternoon was out, but Ava knew it wouldn't be about fixing the problem. It would be about finding the leak. She sat in her office, listening to the echoes in the hallway like waves building offshore. These waves wouldn't drench anyone right away, but soon they'd pull under the very people who thought they could swim. The chaos was spreading, and no one could stuff it back into the neat, sealed envelope it had escaped from. Ava only had to wait. The most frightening thing for people in power wasn't a direct attack. It was the slow realization that something had slipped beyond their reach, second by second. Gregory was in a private meeting when his assistant stepped in, tapping the table to draw his attention. She handed him a printed copy of the now infamous email, her face caught between confusion and fear. Gregory took it, eyes skimming over the stark subject line before landing on the list of attachments. He unlocked his phone and played the first recording. His own voice filled the air, deep, assured, confirming numbers he now knew would raise questions in anyone's mind. Layered between were the smug chuckles of a few members and the affirmations that made it sound like everyone believed every word. A chill crept down his spine. Not because he was unused to risk, but because this time the risk had escaped the boardroom and was now in the hands of people with the power to make him pay. He slammed the phone down on the table, then picked it up again, as if needing to confirm his ears hadn't betrayed him. No, it was clearly him. Clearly his words from only hours ago. Someone in that room had recorded everything, and someone had sent it to exactly the right audience. Gregory didn't ask his assistant who had done it. He just nodded faintly and left the room, walking faster than usual. Light from the hallway hit his face, revealing tight lines along his jaw. Each step thudded against the floor like the knock of an uninvited guest. In his mind, he ran through every face around the table that morning. Who had kept their laptop open? Who hadn't laughed when he cut someone off? Who had reason to want him pushed aside? A few names surfaced, only to be dismissed. That left a short list, and on it, Ava Kingsley. He didn't want to believe it. But the memory of her calm gaze, sitting through a room full of self-congratulation, unsettled him. That silence hadn't felt like surrender. It had felt like preparation. Gregory tightened his grip on the phone as though it held the answer. Outside, employees passed, nodding politely. He returned the gesture absently, his mind fixed on one thought. Someone had turned on the lights in a room he'd always assumed was safe. Power doesn't fear the dark. It fears the light, especially when it shines in exactly the right place. And this light was already aimed at his name. Ava's desk phone rang just as the clock's hands touched 11. 3 chimes, then silence. A brief pause before a low, dry voice came through the line. "See me? Now." No greeting. No explanation. Just 4 clipped words, enough for Ava to know exactly what state Gregory was in. She rose, smoothed her cuff, and stepped into the hallway. As she passed through the open-plan workspace, she caught the sidelong glances of a few employees, furtive, knowing, as if they'd just witnessed something no one was supposed to see. Gregory's office door was shut. A soft knock and his curt "come in" cut through. She stepped inside and felt the shift immediately. This wasn't the sterile, cold white light of the main offices. A muted gold glow from a desk lamp cast shadows into corners. The curtains were drawn, sealing the room off from the outside world. The air felt compressed, thick. His desk was littered with files and papers in no discernible order. Some pages were crumpled at the edges. Others still bore the sharp crease of paper clips, as if yanked hastily from a cabinet. A coffee sat untouched, its black surface still and cold, ringed onto the coaster beneath. Gregory sat behind the desk, fingers interlaced, elbows braced, his eyes fixed on Ava from the moment she entered. Gone was the practiced civility of a chairman at a board meeting. This gaze was colder, heavier, as if weighing the worth of an item now under suspicion. Ava sat opposite him, spine straight, hands resting lightly on her lap. Neither spoke for several seconds. Only the steady tick of the wall clock filled the room, blending with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. Gregory broke the silence first. "You know why you're here?" The words weren't raised, but they thickened the air. Ava kept her expression neutral, neither confirming nor denying. She knew she'd stepped into a space where every word could become evidence, and not in her favor. This room wasn't locked by a key. It was locked by power imbalance. Gregory wanted this conversation here, without witnesses, in a space he believed he controlled entirely, but that belief was itself a weakness. He didn't circle the point. Leaning forward, his voice dropped, each word deliberate, meant to drive deep into the air between them. "You just burned your career to the ground." Ava didn't flinch. She watched his eyes narrow, the lines at the corners deepen as he stressed each word. His voice remained steady, but the weight of a calculated threat sat in it. "You think that little anonymous email stunt can't be traced? I've been here too long to know. Every trail leaves a path. And when I find it, you won't just lose your job. You'll never set foot in another boardroom, in any company, in this entire industry." He paused, letting the words hang. Then he reached into a drawer, pulled out a thick file bound in gray cardboard, and slid it across the desk toward her. "Remember this deal?" Ava set her hand on the cover but didn't open it. Gregory didn't wait. He flipped several pages, jabbing a finger at the signature line. That deal had interesting elements, figures that didn't match, a contract signed in haste, and he tapped the signature. "A legal officer of record, you. If the press ever got this, you'd have no chance to explain. One headline and your name becomes synonymous with fraud." He didn't need to raise his voice. The precision of the words cut like a cold blade on metal. Leaning back, arms crossed, he waited. The warm desk lamp carved shadows over his face, accentuating the thin smile. The smile of a man certain he'd pinned his opponent. Ava glanced at the file, then back at him. For a moment, he might have expected panic, or at least a flicker of fear. But what he found instead was calm. So still it was almost disarming. Gregory didn't realize that at their most confident, people often reveal more than when they're afraid. And he'd just placed on the table a card Ava had once held herself. She opened the file, the shuffle of paper sounding like the opening bars of something Gregory hadn't rehearsed for. Slowly, methodically, she turned the pages until she reached the last one. Her fingertip rested on the signature. The ink had faded slightly, but the stroke was still strong and decisive. The proud signature of someone asserting authority. She looked up, eyes locked on him. "Interesting," she said softly, almost gently. "The approving signatory is you." She pushed the file forward, the space between them now filled with papers bearing his name. Gregory's hand, halfway to reclaiming the folder, slowed. The golden light caught the deeper creases forming across his brow. Ava didn't add another word. She didn't need to. Her silence became a mirror, forcing him to see himself in it. He had brought what he thought was a weapon against her, forgetting that he was the one who had signed it. Gregory inhaled. Slow, heavy. He knew that any defense now would only make the fracture wider. The proof sat inches from his hands, indelible and irreversible. The confidence in his eyes was already shifting, replaced by hurried recalculation. Ava let the silence stretch, each tick of the clock reminding him the balance had shifted. His hand stayed on the file, but he didn't pull it back. He was already trying to rewrite the story in his head, but she knew it was too late. No more words passed between them, but Ava could feel the change. Gregory might still occupy the chair of authority, but he had lost something far rarer than power. He had lost his untouchable status. The game wasn't over, but now Ava was the one holding the cards. Ava leaned back in her chair, eyes never leaving Gregory, her voice low but precise, as if reciting a passage she had long since memorized. "Do you remember that day, Gregory? This office, curtains drawn, just like now. You called me in, set a file down in front of me. This exact file. You told me everything was prepared, that all it needed was my signature, and the company would make it through a rough quarter." Her hand brushed the cover, not to reread it, but to anchor the memory. "I asked why the legal department wasn't reviewing it first. You smiled, said it was too sensitive to share widely. I remember exactly how you set your pen down on the desk, and then looked at me, waiting." Gregory stayed silent, but his hand on the desk curled slightly, knuckles whitening. Ava continued, her tone steady without anger, but every word slicing a little deeper into the composure he was straining to hold. "I signed it, because at the time I thought I was protecting the company. I trusted you, as chairman, to have checked everything. But a few months later, I learned the truth. That contract was designed to cover a shortfall you wanted to hide from the shareholders." She tilted her head, still holding his gaze. "You didn't just make me complicit. You made me your shield. And you thought that shield would stand there forever, taking every blow meant for you." In that moment, the room seemed to shrink. The ticking clock grew sharper, each beat like a countdown to something about to break. Gregory drew a deep breath but gave no reply. Perhaps he knew that any denial now would only sharpen the memory Ava had just placed between them. She smiled faintly, not in amusement but in acknowledgement. "The difference is, Gregory, the shield isn't standing still anymore." He sat there like a statue, but Ava saw the subtle shifts. The deeper furrow between his brows, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, once full of control, now restless, unsettled. He knew. Without a word spoken, they both knew. That signature, that deal, and the truth behind it had turned the file into a noose, and the bitter irony was that he had placed that noose in her hands today. Still, Gregory was a man seasoned in rooms of power. He knew the art of masking thought, so instead of letting unease show, he leaned back, arms folded, offering a thin smile, the same one he'd used to pacify shareholders, charm partners, and mislead opponents. The warm desk lamp lit his hands resting loosely in front of him, but Ava knew they weren't relaxed. Behind them, the calculations were already running. He was racing the clock in his mind, searching for a way to turn the game back in his favor, or at least delay the moment he'd have to pay. Ava stayed still, letting the silence do its work. Because she knew silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a tactic. It forced the other person to sit with themselves, sometimes long enough to crack their own armor. Gregory exhaled, barely audible, but she caught it. Not the sigh of relief, but the breath of someone who's just realized they're standing at the edge. However calm he tried to look, he couldn't erase the truth. One small move from Ava, and it would all come down. They locked eyes, neither blinking. She saw a faint spark of defiance in his gaze, but it was smothered beneath a darker layer. The shadow of a man who knew he no longer held the whole deck. Gregory could pretend he wasn't afraid, but his silence spoke louder than any excuse. And Ava knew in this game that silence meant the balance had shifted squarely to her side. Leaning forward, she closed the file and slid it back to the spot where he had placed it. There was nothing left to say about the words and signatures inside. The room seemed to hold its breath, the clocks ticking the only sound, counting down to something Gregory couldn't yet name. She rose, not hurried, not theatrical. Her heels tapped lightly against the floor, each step clear in the stillness. Gregory stayed seated, eyes tracking her, as if waiting for one last line, some sign she might back down. Ava stopped at the door, her hand on the handle. Without turning, she spoke, her voice just loud enough to carry, each word dropping into the quiet. "You should learn to listen before it's too late." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even advice. It was a small mirror handed to him so he could see the space arrogance had carved out. It lingered, not because she said it loudly, but because it carried what Gregory lacked, the composure of someone holding the advantage. She opened the door. Light from the hallway sliced into the dimness, cutting a sharp line across the room's shadows. The air outside felt cooler, wider, as if stepping across the threshold shed the weight of manufactured power. Ava stepped through, the door closing softly behind her with a muted click, like a temporary full stop. Inside, Gregory remained seated. Her words hung in the air, refusing to fade the way he wanted. He was used to conversations ending in silences that belonged to him. This time, the silence belonged to Ava, and it carried more weight than any report or accusation. Ava moved down the hall, her face unreadable, but the cold glint in her eyes had softened into something else. Expectation. She knew that last line wouldn't let Gregory sleep easily. It would make him think about what he'd missed, and more importantly, what she might do next. Because sometimes the greatest warning doesn't come in shouts or threats, but in a line short enough to remember, and light enough to make you wonder what it really means. The news didn't break through an official announcement, but through half-finished sentences in hallways, quick messages sent during lunch breaks, and brief knowing glances exchanged as someone walked by. At first, it was only a few managers whispering that the shareholders are reviewing the files. Slowly, the story morphed into they're launching a full-scale investigation. It took only one afternoon for the information to escalate. The list of people summoned to provide data grew, from legal to finance to internal audit. And at the very top of the special meeting notice was Gregory Hines. Ava wasn't the one spreading the word, but she watched the shift ripple outward like an oil stain. Gregory's longtime allies began to keep their distance. Conversations that once lit up when he entered the room now dwindled to a polite greeting. Even in Monday's staff meeting, the chair next to him, once fought over by those eager to appear close, remained empty. Gregory still entered the meeting room as always, tie straight, step steady, but everyone could see the circle around him had tightened. No more warm laughter, no more teasing questions before work began. Instead, eyes stayed on screens. Hands busied themselves with turning pages as if no one wanted to be caught looking his way. Outside meetings, Gregory began having lunch alone in his office instead of at the communal dining area. He stopped dropping by departments for casual check-ins, a habit that had once built his approachable image. Ava knew it wasn't because he was busier, it was because he didn't want to face the half-hearted nods and lukewarm smiles. Meanwhile, in the higher floors, the major shareholders had booked closed-door sessions. Files covering Gregory's entire tenure were pulled from storage. Some were public reports, but others, more detailed, more sensitive, had never left internal circulation. Ava wasn't in those rooms, but she knew. Each page turned would tighten the rope Gregory was pretending not to feel around his neck. Isolation never arrived with noise. It came gradually, one step at a time, until the isolated person realized no one was close enough to hear them speak. And once that distance was established, returning was almost impossible. Gregory hadn't lost his chair yet, but Ava understood. Sometimes losing power doesn't begin with a vote. It begins the moment people stop treating you as the center of the room. He had once been the kind of man whose mere entrance activated his power network like a single living organism. Nods, affirmations, quick but firm handshakes. All silent signals that he was not only respected but protected. Now that organism was decaying, and Gregory could feel the change like a cold seeping from skin to bone. In closed meetings, those who once defended him without question now just listened, rarely stepping in to reinforce his stance. Occasionally, their eyes would flicker toward him, then away just as quickly, as though eye contact had become an unnecessary risk. In the corridors, he still tried to maintain old habits, pausing to ask after someone's day, telling a short story to break the ice. But all he got in return were polite smiles, thin as glass. When he turned away, footsteps behind him quickened, as if people were eager to maintain a safe distance. Even those he'd once considered confidants, people who'd stayed up late drinking with him on business trips, whispering internal secrets, now chose silence. A veteran assistant stopped sending him advance briefing notes, citing other urgent priorities. A director he had once saved from dismissal was suddenly absent from their usual informal gatherings. Gregory understood. This wasn't random. Power networks were built on mutual benefit, and when that benefit was threatened, the links detached themselves to survive. No one wanted to sink with a ship taking on water, and in their eyes, he was no longer the untouchable captain. At an internal function, Gregory stepped into the banquet hall, but instead of conversations opening up to welcome him, small clusters closed ranks, their backs turned. A few still laughed, but their voices dipped when he passed. Invisible gaps formed in the air, unnamed but felt by everyone. The collapse of a power network never announced itself with a bang. It began with hairline fractures that spread until the whole structure couldn't stand. Gregory might still hold the chair, but it was no longer supported by loyal pillars. And when the foundation shakes, the slightest touch can bring it all down. That morning, Gregory entered the building with a deliberate, steady gait, as if he still controlled the pace of everything around him. But the moment he sat at his desk, a white envelope stamped in red was already waiting. No lengthy explanation, just a short note from the board. Suspension, indefinite, pending investigation. He read the sentence twice, his eyes lingering on the word suspension. A simple word, but heavy enough to drag down decades of power. No one stood outside the door to gauge his reaction. No urgent knocks bringing rescue plans. Just him, the thin sheet of paper, and the empty space of a room once filled with ringing phones and constant footsteps. Gregory rose and walked to the large boardroom. The space was unnervingly still. Leather chairs sat in neat rows, the polished table gleamed. But the most important thing was missing: the people who used to sit around it, listening and following his lead. He walked the length of the table, fingers brushing the wood. Every small scratch was a trace of past meetings. The times he slammed his hand to seal a decision, the coffee cup set down too hard in heated debate. Now, those memories no longer carried triumph. They echoed like distant sounds from a time he couldn't return to. At the head of the table, the chairman's chair remained. He didn't sit. Instead, he looked up at the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked forward, each tick-tock, echoing through the empty room. Each sound was a nail sealing the truth. His time here was over. Outside, work might have gone on as usual, but Gregory knew, in hallway whispers, in closed group chats, the news of his suspension had already spread. And like a crack in glass, once it appeared, it would only grow until everything shattered. He turned and left the room, leaving behind the cold stillness and the relentless ticking, counting down to the moment someone else would take that chair. The boardroom was brighter than usual. Morning sunlight spilled through the wide glass panels, stretching across the wooden table like a carpet of light leading directly to the chairman's chair. Now empty. There was no Gregory seated there, no striking red tie, no figure leaning back with eyes surveying the entire room. Most of the board members were already present, but none sat in that seat. Some avoided even looking at it, as though the emptiness might swallow anyone foolish enough to try and fill it. Papers rustled, pens tapped softly against the table, and fragments of small talk drifted through the air, thin attempts to break the silence. The door opened. Ava Kingsley walked in, unhurried, without the faintest trace of grandstanding. Today she wore a deep navy dress instead of her usual lighter shades, black heels landing firmly on the polished wooden floor, the sound sharp enough to draw heads up. Her eyes swept the room, not lingering long on anyone, yet making each person feel as though they had been seen. She didn't look at the empty chair right away. Instead, she circled the table, set a folder down at her usual spot, then allowed her gaze to settle on the space at the head of the table. Not with longing, but with an assessing calm, measuring whether it still held value without the people strong enough to uphold it. A board member cleared his throat, gesturing toward her seat. But instead of complying, she walked to the head of the table, stopping beside the chairman's chair. Sunlight from the glass wall spilled over her, casting a long shadow across the table, covering even the papers and water glasses in front of others. No one objected. Perhaps they all understood that today's meeting would not unfold as usual. That empty chair was more than just a seat. It was a silence of power, and that silence demanded someone to fill it. Ava placed her hand lightly on the back of the chair, not sitting, only tilting her head slightly, her gaze steady. She wasn't in a hurry. This room had once done everything it could to quiet her, but now they were waiting for her to speak. And it was that waiting that shifted the balance. They had once believed that power resided in the person who sat there. Ava knew that true power came from making the entire room turn toward you, even before you took the seat. She kept her hand on the chair for one more beat, then let go and walked around the table. No slides, no documents opened. She simply stood with both hands resting lightly before her, eyes sweeping over each face. "I won't begin with a report or a plan," she said, her voice even clear. "Today, I want to tell you a story." A few members frowned, faintly. They were accustomed to meetings opening with revenue charts, market share graphs, or lists of targets. A fable felt out of place, especially here. But Ava didn't allow the doubt to settle. "Once," she began, "there was a small bird living in a vast forest. Every spring it sang, not to show off its voice, but to signal that the new season had arrived. Then one day the bigger birds told it to be silent. They said the forest didn't need a weak song to disrupt its steady rhythm." She moved slowly toward the empty chair, sunlight catching her face, giving her tone a warm, yet certain weight. "So the little bird went quiet. It stopped singing. Spring still came, but the forest was quieter. No one noticed until one year summer came later than usual. Trees bloomed late. Bees and butterflies were fewer. And then they realized they had lost the song that once called the seasons to start on time." She paused, letting the silence settle over the table. When they went looking for the bird, it had flown to another forest, one where it was heard. Some eyes shifted from the empty chair to Ava. The story was simple, yet carried a familiar undertone. A faint smile touched her lips, as though she didn't need to explain further. "We can debate numbers all day, but if we don't know how to listen to the quieter voices, we risk missing our best seasons." There was no lecture, no open criticism. Yet every word carried another layer about this room, about the springs it had missed, and if nothing changed, they would face another late summer. Ava returned to her place but didn't sit. She let the story hang like both an invitation and a warning. She waited long enough for every gaze to turn toward her, not because of role or title, but because they couldn't help it. That kind of attention only came when the listener recognized something in the story that touched them. Her voice lowered, pulling them into what felt like the end of a secret. "Some say silence is acceptance, but for the little bird, silence was gathering strength. That spring, it didn't sing. It listened to the wind, the rain, the heartbeat of the forest. It learned when flowers would bloom, when fruit would fall, and when summer came, it sang, not with the thin voice of the year before, but with a sound so full it made the entire forest stop." Ava's steps were steady as she moved around the table. The bigger birds, the ones who had told it to hush, now listened, trying to understand how its song carried the scent of the season, the rhythm of leaves, the light of the sun. No one called it weak again. Because when you've learned to observe everything in silence, every word you speak carries a weight no noise can drown out. She stopped behind the chairman's chair, her hand resting lightly on its back, as though the metaphor was never just about a forest. The question isn't whether the little bird sang or not. The question is, when it does, who will be brave enough to listen? Quick glances passed between a few members as if they had just understood how the parable had pierced the surface to touch the reality of this room. Ava didn't smile. She knew she'd planted a seed that would take root in the meetings to come, in how they looked at this empty chair, and in the choice of who might fill it. She released the chair and walked back to her place. The click of her heels seemed to match the clock's steady tick. When she finally sat, the room stayed silent. Not with the strained quiet of past meetings, but with the stillness that follows hearing something that can't be ignored. Ava opened the folder before her, though she didn't turn the first page. She didn't need to. The story had already done the most important work, making the people who thought they controlled every sound in this room ask themselves, if they didn't listen today, would they ever get the chance to hear it again? When Ava finished her story, not a single whisper broke the air. The boardroom sank into a rare kind of stillness. Not the stillness of confusion, but of a slow spreading realization. Faces accustomed to maintaining an impassive mask had shifted. A few leaned back in their chairs as though the fable had made them see the empty chairman's seat in a different light. Others dropped their gaze, pretending to study documents, but in truth avoiding Ava's eyes, because they knew they'd recognize something and weren't ready to admit it. The steady hum of the air conditioning and the ticking clock echoed across the polished wood table, each sound a reminder that this silence couldn't last forever. Yet no one wanted to be the first to break it. Ava didn't add another word, nor did she try to fill the gap with figures or explanations. She simply sat still, turning a page in her folder, her eyes drifting to the glass wall where the city's towers reflected the morning light into the room. In that moment, they began to understand. Power doesn't always belong to the one at the head of the table or the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the one who can make the entire room fall silent to listen, and more importantly, to the one who leaves them thinking about what they heard long after the meeting ends. An older board member leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His gaze toward Ava no longer carried scrutiny, but silent acknowledgement. Another, once a staunch ally of Gregory, glanced at the empty seat and then at Ava. A fleeting look, yet enough to signal that the old order was beginning to fracture. Ava remained silent, but it was the kind of silence that compelled others to break it. And she knew whoever spoke first would be admitting they'd fallen into the influence she'd just cast over the room. The silence stretched, and within it, people began to wonder, if Ava were to take the chairman's seat, what would change? And if she didn't, were they turning away from the only voice that could call a new season for this forest? Ava set down her pen, stacked her papers neatly, and rose. The scrape of her chair rang sharply in the stillness, making every bowed head lift. She walked to the head of the table, stopping just behind the empty seat. "There's one thing I want to say before we move forward," she began. Her tone calm yet deliberate, each word dropping like stones into still water. "From today, everyone here has permission to speak." A flicker passed through a few eyes. Surprise, doubt, even caution. But Ava didn't let the pause swallow her words. She leaned forward slightly, hands resting on the table, her gaze sweeping over each face. "But first," she continued, "learn to listen." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with the weight of a command, wrapped in the gentleness of advice. No one interrupted. A few pressed their lips together as if about to speak, then thought better of it, perhaps realizing that without listening, they'd miss something more valuable than the right to talk. Ava began walking back to her seat, but paused beside one board member, locking eyes with him. "Speaking isn't to hear yourself. Speaking is to add something of value to the conversation. And to do that, you must first listen all the way through." She moved on, leaving in her wake an atmosphere both tense and expectant. No one was certain whether this was merely symbolic or the opening act of a new era, one where strategic silence outweighed meaningless noise. When Ava sat again, she no longer avoided anyone's eyes. Everyone here has experience, knowledge, and their own voice. But that voice only has value when it isn't buried under arrogance or the habit of imposing. If we want to move forward, this is the new rule of the game. The phrase "new rule of the game" landed like a line drawn across the table. No one objected, but in many eyes Ava saw the calculation, whether they would adapt or be pushed out of the board altogether. She didn't need them to decide now. Ava knew that a single rule, linking the right to speak with the duty to truly listen, was enough to shift the room's balance of power. And such a shift would make some people impatient, and impatience would reveal their weaknesses. She turned her chair slightly so her back faced the room, and her eyes looked out at the floor-to-ceiling glass. The afternoon city stretched before her like a living map. Traffic currents like arteries, towers catching the last gold of the sun, and somewhere in the distance a small bird cutting across the air, its wings slicing the quiet. Behind her, the shuffling of papers, the scrape of chairs, the measured breaths, all faded into the background. She didn't need to look to know no one was leaving, and no one dared to break the silence she'd placed over them like a weight. She studied the city as if it were a giant chessboard, each building a piece, each stream of people a tactic, and she, once silenced in this very room, now held the choice of when to make the next move. There are crowns, her voice carried, not loud but reaching everyone, that need no applause, only silent respect. The words fell, light yet sharp, like a blade so finely honed it cut deep without force. Someone shifted in their seat, but no reply came, because they all understood she had just declared a kind of power no vote could bestow, and no scheme could easily take away. Ava took a slow breath, rose, and walked to the door. Each step confirmed that she needed no one's permission to move forward. When her hand touched the handle, she didn't look back, knowing that the image of a black woman quietly leaving after redefining the rules would linger far longer than any speech. The door closed behind her, leaving the boardroom steeped in a silence heavier than noise. And in that silence, each person wondered, had they just witnessed an ending? Or the beginning of a new reign? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.